All right, diving right in, looks like we've got a mountain of articles here all about software testing,
Oh, yeah.
specifically gray box testing. So,
Lots to unpack.
our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to figure out what this whole gray box thing is really all about and why our listeners should care.
Well, it's definitely a hot topic in the software world, and for good reason. When you're dealing with these systems where you need at least some insight into how things work under the hood.
But you don't necessarily need to have all the code laid out in front of you.
Exactly. That's where gray box testing really shines. It finds that sweet spot between, knowing everything like in white box testing.
And knowing absolutely nothing, which I guess is black box testing.
Right. It's about striking a balance.
So let's try to paint a picture for our listeners. Imagine you're testing a web application, something we all use every day, like online banking.
Perfect example.
If you were doing gray box testing, you wouldn't just be clicking around like a regular user. You'd actually have a bit of a peek behind the curtain.
You might know how the database is structured, for instance.
Or maybe a bit about how the site handles user sessions. But you wouldn't necessarily need the full code base to do your job.
And that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
You get a more thorough testing approach than you would with pure black box testing.
But it's not as resource intensive as white box testing. You don't need a whole team of developers to hold your hand through the process.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance, thoroughness and efficiency. Speaking of which, one of the articles you sent had this really handy table comparing black box, white box, and gray box testing side by side.
Oh, that's a good one. It really lays out the differences, like a cheat sheet for understanding the different approaches.
It highlights how much the tester's knowledge changes between those three approaches. And that, of course, affects what they focus on during testing.
Okay, so this table is basically telling us that in gray box testing, you're paying a lot of attention to how all the different parts of a system work together.
That's a big part of it. We're talking about the interactions between databases, APIs, middleware, all that good stuff.
Okay, but why is that so important? Why do we care about how all those different parts connect?
Well, think about it this way. Those connections are often where the vulnerabilities hide, the weak points in the system. For example, a lot of the articles you sent brought up session handling as a key area where gray box testing can really shine.
Right. Session handling, basically how the system manages your login and keeps your data safe.
Right. And if there are weaknesses in how sessions are managed, well, that could be a big problem, especially for something like online banking.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is a big deal. So gray box testing can help us prevent some pretty serious security breaches.
Absolutely. It's a crucial part of building secure and reliable systems.
But how does it actually work in practice? It can't just be random poking around, right? There has to be some sort of process.
Oh, definitely. There's a process. But like any good testing strategy, it can be adapted to fit the specific project.
Okay, good. So it's not like we're stuck following a rigid set of rules. There's some flexibility.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's walk through the process then. And to keep things relatable for our listeners, we'll stick with that online banking example.
Sounds good.
So what's the first step? Where do we even begin?
Well, the first step is always to define the scope of your testing.
Okay, define the scope. What does that actually mean?
It means deciding what part of the system you're going to focus on. For our online banking example, let's say we're looking at the transfer funds functionality. We need to figure out what parts of that system we have at least some internal knowledge about.
So maybe we know a little bit about the database schema that stores account balances.
Right. Or we have some information about the API calls that are used to process the actual transactions.
Okay, so step one is all about figuring out what part of the system we're going to test and what we already know about it.
Exactly. And then once you have that scope defined, you can move on to step two, which is
Designing the test cases.
you got it. But here's the thing. With gray box testing, you're not just thinking like a user anymore.
You're thinking like a user who happens to have a secret decoder ring.
Kind of. You're using that knowledge of the system's inner workings to come up with test scenarios that might expose problems.
So for example, what happens if the API call fails in the middle of a transaction?
Exactly. Or what if someone tries to transfer more money than their account balance allows?
It's like setting clever traps to catch those pesky bugs. I like it. So we've defined the scope, we've designed our test cases, now we actually run the tests, right?
That's step three. And that involves selecting the right tools and frameworks for the job.
Okay, so we're running our tests, checking if those API calls are working correctly, making sure that database records are being updated as expected. What happens next?
But we watch those test results very closely. We monitor the output and gather all the data we can. And that leads us to step 4,
Which is dot drum roll, please.
analyzing the results. We have to figure out what all that data actually means.
So we're looking for bugs, of course, but are we looking for anything else? What other insights are we trying to get from all of this?
Well, finding bugs is important, but it's not the whole story. We also want to understand how the system behaves under different conditions. Does it perform well under pressure? Is it secure? Is it reliable?
So it's about more than just fixing individual issues. It's about making sure the software as a whole is robust and resilient.
Exactly. We're trying to improve the overall quality of the software, not just patch up a few holes. And that's where the techniques used in gray box testing come into play. That's when things get really interesting.
Ooh, I knew you were going to say that. All right, spill the beans. Which techniques are you most excited about?
Well, there are quite a few, but two that stand out are matrix testing and regression testing. With matrix testing, you basically create a grid of all the different inputs and outputs you want to evaluate. It's a really systematic way to cover a lot of ground.
So like a map of all the different scenarios you want to test.
Exactly. And regression testing is all about making sure that any changes you make to the system don't break things that were already working.
So let's say you make a change to the API that's used for transferring funds. How does regression testing fit into that?
It helps to ensure that that change didn't accidentally break something else, like the part of the system that handles balance inquiries.
So it's like a safety net to make sure you're not creating new problems while you're trying to fix old ones.
Exactly. And both of those techniques, matrix testing and regression testing, really tie back to the benefits of gray box testing that we were talking about earlier.
Right, the security and performance aspects.
Yep. For example, with matrix testing, you're systematically trying all these different input combinations. This can uncover unexpected security vulnerabilities.
Like what happens if someone tries to enter a ridiculously large amount of money for a transfer? Or uses some funky special characters in their password?
Exactly. You're essentially trying to break the system on purpose to find its weak points. And with regression testing, you're making sure those changes you made haven't impacted the system's performance.
So if the online banking system usually processes 1,000 transactions per minute, and a change to the API suddenly drops that down to 100 transactions per minute, regression testing would flag that as a major issue.
Absolutely.
Mm.
It's all about maintaining performance stability and preventing those slowdowns that can drive users crazy.
Okay, so we've gone through the process, we've talked about some of the key techniques. It's clear that gray box testing isn't just one thing, it's a whole approach with lots of different facets. But now I bet our listeners sitting there thinking, okay, this all sounds great in theory, but how does it actually work in the real world?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And that's where case studies come in handy.
Oh, do you have a favorite from the research you've done? One that really shows the power of gray box testing?
Well, there are a bunch of interesting ones. But the one that really stands out is the case study about the fintech company. They were developing a new online banking platform, and they were using gray box testing to validate their security features.
Wait, don't spoil it. I want to hear this like a suspenseful story.
Okay. Picture this. You've got this cutting-edge fintech company. They're building a brand new online banking platform with all the bells and whistles. Security is paramount, so they're putting it through rigorous testing.
Okay, I'm hooked. What happens next?
Their team of gray box testers is armed with some knowledge about the application's session management, but not the full source code. They're on the hunt for vulnerabilities. And what do they find?
What? Tell me.
A critical vulnerability, one that could have allowed hackers to take over user sessions.
That's terrifying. How did they find it?
Through clever test case design, they specifically targeted the session expiration and reauthentication systems. Essentially, they were mimicking what a hacker might try to do. And that revealed this major security gap that the developers were then able to fix.
Wow, gray box testing really saved the day. It's a perfect example of how understanding a system's inner workings, even just partially, can make all the difference.
It really is. And this case study highlights a key point. Gray box testing is incredibly useful when you're dealing with sensitive data and complex security features. It lets you target your testing efforts in a way that just wouldn't be possible with black box testing alone.
Okay, so this isn't just some abstract concept. It can have a real impact on the security of our systems and our data.
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool in the fight against cybercrime.
But as with any powerful tool, there are probably limitations, right?
Of course, no testing method is perfect.
Yeah.
And the articles you sent did a good job of outlining some of the potential drawbacks of gray box testing.
All right, well, let's do a quick rundown of those pros and cons then. Starting with the advantages. What are the key benefits?
One of the biggest advantages is efficiency. You don't need access to the full code base to create really detailed and effective test scenarios. So it can be much more cost-effective compared to something like white box testing.
Right, you're not spending weeks or months just trying to understand the code before you can even start testing.
Exactly. And because you're using this hybrid approach, you're more likely to find those tricky bugs that might be hiding in the interactions between different parts of the system.
Which ultimately leads to higher quality software.
Exactly. And as we saw with our case study, gray box testing is a great way to enhance security. It lets you really assess how data is handled and controlled within the system.
Those are some strong arguments in favor of gray box testing. But what about the flip side? What are some of the potential downsides that our listeners should be aware of?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that you might miss bugs that are hidden in areas of the code you don't have access to. It's like trying to solve a mystery with only half the clues.
So you're really relying on having good documentation of the system's internal workings.
Yes. And that can be a bit of a gamble because, as we all know, documentation isn't always a developer's top priority.
That's a pain point that many developers can relate to, I'm sure. So reliance on documentation is one potential drawback. Are there others?
Another one is that it can take a bit more time to develop those clever test cases when you only have limited knowledge.
So it's a trade-off. You're sacrificing a bit of speed for a greater depth of testing.
Exactly. And lastly, there can be a bit of a learning curve. Testers need to have a good grasp of the software's architecture, which might require some additional training.
Okay, so there are definitely some trade-offs to consider, but this all begs the question. What if you don't have good documentation? Is Greybox testing even possible then?
That's a fantastic question and a very common concern. The good news is that even with limited documentation, there are ways to make gray box testing work.
Oh, really? Tell me more. How do you overcome that documentation hurdle?
Well, one approach is to start small. Focus on the areas where you do have some insight. Maybe there are certain modules or components that are better documented than others.
So start with what you know and build from there.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to reach out to the people who built the system. Talk to the developers, designers, anyone who might have valuable insights that aren't captured in the formal documentation.
It's about tapping into that collective knowledge, even if it's not all neatly organized in one place.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I love about gray box testing. It encourages collaboration and communication.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we've done a pretty thorough deep dive into the world of gray box testing. We've covered the basics, the process, the techniques, the tools, the pros, the cons.
We even threw in a real-world case study for good measure.
We did, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface. There's still so much more to learn about gray box testing and about how those core principles can be applied to other areas of our lives.
Absolutely. And that's a conversation we can continue in part 2 of our deep dive. Welcome back to our gray box deep dive. So we left off talking about how even without perfect documentation, you can still make gray box testing work.
Right, by starting small, focusing on the areas where you do have some solid information, and talking to the people who actually built the system.
Exactly. Those developers, designers, they hold a wealth of knowledge that might not always be written down.
It's like going straight to the source, getting the inside scoop.
Right. It's about collaboration and communication, tapping into that collective wisdom.
I like that. So, documentation aside, another challenge we touched on was finding the right balance between black box and white box techniques.
Yeah, that's sweet spot.
How much internal knowledge is enough to make gray box testing effective? When does it become too much, tipping the scales more toward white box?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
No magic formula.
I wish. It really depends on a lot of factors. The specific system you're testing, the risks involved, the resources you have available.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Definitely not. Sometimes a little bit of knowledge can go a long way. You find a critical vulnerability just by knowing a bit about the database structure.
But other times, you really need to dive deeper into the system's architecture to design effective tests.
Right, and that's where the tester's judgment comes in. They need to be able to analyze the situation, assess the risks, and choose the right approach.
So gray box testing is a bit of an art form then, not just blindly following a set of rules.
Exactly. It's about being adaptable, creative even, making those smart decisions based on the context of the project.
Makes sense. We've been talking a lot about gray box testing specifically for software, but it occurs to me that this whole approach, this mindset, could be applied to so many other things.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. The principles of gray box testing, they're not limited to software. They can be applied to any complex system where you have some knowledge, but not a complete picture.
Give me an example. I'm intrigued. How could you use gray box thinking outside of software?
Well, think about a mechanic diagnosing a car problem, right? They have some knowledge about how cars work, but they don't necessarily know the full history of that particular vehicle.
So they're working with limited information, kind of like a gray box tester.
Exactly. So what do? They gather as much information as possible, ask the owner about the symptoms, listen to the engine, run some basic tests.
They're using their existing knowledge, along with the data they gather, to try and figure out what's wrong.
Right, like piecing together a puzzle.
Yeah.
And then they use their knowledge of car systems to test those hypotheses. They might check the spark plugs, the fuel filter, the battery.
They're not just randomly replacing parts, they're using a strategic, informed approach.
Exactly, and that strategic approach, that's the essence of gray box thinking. You're finding that balance between relying on your existing knowledge and gathering new information as you go.
And you could apply that same process to other fields too, right?
Absolutely. A doctor diagnosing a patient, a detective investigating a crime, they often have to make decisions based on incomplete information. Gray box thinking can help them navigate those complexities.
Wow, I love that. Gray box thinking as a life skill. Okay, but let's bring it back to the world of software for a moment. We've talked about the process, the challenges, even the wider applications of this whole gray box mindset. But there's one crucial aspect we haven't really discussed yet.
What's that?
Tools. Even the
Yeah.
most brilliant tester needs the right tools to do their job effectively.
You are absolutely right. Tools are essential, and thankfully, gray box testers have a lot of options.
Yeah.
But it's not about having a whole separate set of gray box specific tools.
So we're not talking about some secret toolbox that only gray box testers know about.
Nope, not at all. Many of the tools used in black box and white box testing can be used in a gray box context too.
So it's more about how you use the tools rather than the tools themselves.
Exactly. It's about choosing the right tool for the job and using it in a way that aligns with the gray box approach.
Okay, I'm following you. Can you give me an example?
Sure. API testing tools. They're widely used in black box testing, but they can be incredibly helpful in gray box testing as well.
Because you're often testing those interactions between different components like APIs and databases.
Exactly. By sending specific requests to APIs and observing the responses, testers can learn a lot about how the system behaves internally, even without looking at the code.
It's like they're sending a little probe into the system to gather information.
Perfect analogy. And there are many other tools that can be used in a similar way. Even debugging tools, which are traditionally used in white box testing, can sometimes be helpful in a gray box context.
Wait, hold on. Don't debuggers require access to the source code? How can they be used in gray box testing where you only have partial knowledge?
You're right, full-blown debugging might not be possible. But some debuggers allow you to inspect the state of the system at certain points, even without access to the code.
Interesting. So you're getting a sneak peek into the inner workings, even if you can't fully control everything.
Exactly. It can be really helpful for understanding data flow and spotting potential bottlenecks. And let's not forget about performance testing tools. Those are essential for assessing how the system behaves under pressure, which is a big part of gray box testing.
Right, because you're not just testing if it works, you're testing if it works well, especially when things get busy.
Exactly. You want to know if the system can handle the expected number of users, transactions, data volume, all of that, without crashing or slowing down to a crawl.
It's like stress testing the system to make sure it can handle real-world conditions.
That's a great way to put it. Performance testing tools let you simulate those real-world scenarios and see how the system holds up.
Okay, so we've got API testing tools, debugging tools, performance testing tools. Sounds like gray box testers have a pretty diverse toolkit at their disposal.
They do. And the toolkit's always expanding as new technologies come along. That's part of what makes this field so exciting. It's constantly evolving.
Always something new to learn, right? So we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our gray box deep dive. We talked about those documentation challenges, finding that balance between black box and white box techniques. We even took a little detour into gray box thinking as a life skill.
It was a fun detour.
It was. And of course, we can't forget about the importance of having the right tools for the job.
Right. And the tools themselves are constantly evolving, which is both exciting and maybe a little daunting.
True. But hey, that's the world of technology for you. Always changing, always keeping us on our toes.
Exactly. And speaking of change and looking ahead, in the final part of our Gray Box deep dive, we'll talk about some of the trends shaping the future of this field. And we'll leave our listener with some thought-provoking questions to ponder.
Sounds good to me. See you in part 3. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the final stretch of our exploration of gray box testing. We've covered a lot of ground, from the fundamentals to real-world applications. But just like any complex system, gray box testing has its challenges.
It does. And it's important to understand those challenges so we can, learn to overcome them.
So let's jump right in. What are some of the biggest hurdles people face when they're trying to implement gray box testing effectively?
Well, one of the biggest challenges, and we touched on this earlier, is that reliance on documentation.
Right. Good documentation.
Gray box testing really depends on having a good understanding of how the system works internally. But
Yeah, okay.
if that documentation is outdated, incomplete, or just plain wrong,
It can really throw a wrench into the works.
it definitely can. It can lead to wasted time, frustration, and ultimately less effective testing.
It's like trying to navigate a new city with a map that's full of mistakes.
Exactly. You might end up lost or going in circles. Another challenge is finding that balance between those black box and white box techniques.
Right, because gray box testing is all about finding that sweet spot, that middle ground.
Exactly. But how do you know when you've hit it? How much internal knowledge is enough? And when does it become too much?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is there a rule of thumb?
Unfortunately, there's no easy answer, no magic formula.
Ah.
It often comes down to experience, intuition, a deep understanding of the specific system you're testing.
So it's a bit of an art as well as a science.
You could say that. It's about making informed decisions based on the context of the project.
So sometimes you might lean more towards those black box techniques.
Right, focusing on those user interactions.
And other times you might need to dig deeper into the code, use more of those white box strategies.
Exactly. It's about being flexible and adaptable, adjusting your approach as needed.
Just like our gray box testing chameleon.
Huh. We've come full circle.
We have. And speaking of adapting, let's talk about the future of gray box testing. This field is constantly evolving, just like the technology it's used to test.
Absolutely. Always changing.
So crystal ball time. What trends are you seeing on the horizon for gray box testing? What does the future hold?
Well, one of the biggest trends is the increasing complexity of software systems. We're moving towards a world of interconnected devices, cloud-based applications, microservices, architectures.
So more moving parts, more potential points of failure, more things to test.
Exactly. And that means gray box testing is going to become even more crucial. Testers will need to be able to understand how all these complex systems interact, identify those vulnerabilities, ensure performance and reliability.
So gray box testing is future-proof. It's not going anywhere.
Not at all. I think it will only become more relevant and important in the years to come. Another trend is the rise of automation. More and more tools are being developed to automate different parts of software testing.
But wait, can you even automate gray box testing? Doesn't it require human intuition, decision-making?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a common misconception. While some aspects of gray box testing will always require human expertise, many tasks can be automated.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Sure, API testing, performance testing, even some security testing can be automated very effectively.
So it's about finding the right balance between human and machine.
Exactly. The future of gray box testing will likely involve this hybrid approach, leveraging the strengths of both.
Makes sense. And of course, we can't forget about security. That's a huge concern these days.
Absolutely. Security is paramount, and gray box testing has a critical role to play.
Because it gives you that ability to really test those vulnerabilities at the integration points between different components.
Right. As systems become more interconnected, those integration points become prime targets for attacks.
Makes sense. So gray box testing isn't just about finding bugs. It's about protecting our data, our systems, and ultimately ourselves.
Well said. It's about building trust in a world that increasingly relies on technology.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into gray box testing. We've explored the principles, the process, the challenges, the tools, even the broader applications of gray box thinking.
We've even looked ahead to the future of this fascinating field.
We have. And I think it's safe to say that our listener is now well equipped to navigate the world of gray box testing. They have the knowledge, the insights, and hopefully the inspiration to apply this approach and make a real difference in the world of software development. And who knows, maybe they'll even start applying those gray box thinking skills to other areas of their lives.
You never know where those skills might come in handy.
Exactly. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep testing those boundaries.